Hola, estudiantes. Today we are looking at the Open Educational Textbook. I've taken us to the homepage of our Canvas class. You will see the textbook link right here at the top. So you click it, it's going to take us to the Introduction to Ethnic Studies text. And we are looking at the chapter on intersectionality, which is chapter 8. Here it is. And if you click here, it's going to show you your objectives for what you should be learning in this chapter. And I think it's really important to note that we will be getting a variety of women of color, queer, and trans people of color engaging and resisting interlocking systems of power as they relate to the intersections of some of these identities or spaces that we can occupy. So if you start with the introduction, it's a really good personal story from one of the authors, Kay Fisher. And you'll see that they're talking about a visual artist, Julio Salgado, and he is a queer, undocumented artist based out of the Bay Area, Los Angeles area. And I think that what is really powerful in this story and in Salgado's art is this right here, how intersectionality examines the intersecting structures of power, such as white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, that can limit, marginalize, or oppress people based on race, class, gender identity, immigration status, national origin, and the list goes on and on. And so it's a very interesting way of looking at the interpersonal in terms of how we interact with each other as individuals, and then internalized levels of oppression. And I think that this introduction also humanizes intersectionality based on how people can express it and the fact that this is an artist expressing it. And there is a particular piece mentioned here, and Fisher lets you know that you can access a blog interview. I did click on the blog interview, and you can see the image once you sign up. So if you don't have an account, you'll notice it'll look like this, and you're going to need to sign up to read the full article. So the piece that is referenced is later on in this article, but these are other examples of the artwork that's being discussed. If you go to the next page, what is intersectionality? So that is the question. If you've never heard the term before, by the time you're done with this chapter, you should be able to answer what that means. And they take us back, the authors take us back to Black feminist scholars, because intersectionality is an idea. The word itself was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black lawyer individual. But even before the term was really coined, you have people like Audre Lorde, who is pictured above, that are explaining some of these hierarchies and some of these intersections of binaries of good and bad, superior and inferior, and dominant and subordinate. And Audre Lorde, as a Black queer feminist, identifies marginalization that she experiences in white feminist spaces. So I think this quote here in particular at the end of the paragraph, now we must recognize differences among women who are equals, neither inferior nor superior, and devise ways to use each other's difference to enrich our visions and our joint struggles. So instead of letting the differences divide, that we need to somehow come together in order to really liberate oppressed peoples and individuals. And in terms of types of women of color and queer and undocuqueer people, and there's a great list here of different groups that can experience the interlocking systems of power in terms of, yes, race and ethnicity, but gender, sexuality, nationality, that it's important to see these oppressions or these interlocking instances of power in order to understand, for instance, here's an example of police violence and how it can target certain individuals over others. So remember I mentioned Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor of law, a lawyer. So there's a really great video, and I'll include it in our discussion page. But it's also here, The Urgency of Intersectionality, in which Dr. Crenshaw talks about all of the Black women that have been killed by police officers and how important it is to say their name and to understand their stories in terms of how their intersectionalities cause them to slip through, and here's a really great quote here, slip through our consciousness because there were no frames for us to see them. But it doesn't have to be this way. And so intersectionality happened when she was defending or bringing forward a civil case from, and here's the story right here actually, Emma de Graffenried. And she claimed in her place of business that she experienced gender discrimination and racial discrimination. And when Crenshaw brought this to the courts, the legal system had no language or framework to see that both forms of discrimination could be happening at the same time. So the argument used by the judge for dismissing her suit was that the employer hired African Americans and they hired women. But what wasn't pointed out is that all the African Americans that were hired were men and that the women were white women. And so, as a lawyer, she realized that there was something lacking in the justice system that was causing this one woman to be invisible in the law and her experiences. So, this Emma individual. And that's why she started developing this theory and this term of intersectionality as a way to give voice and to acknowledge the experiences that marginalized people within these interlocking systems of power, that they face a particular discrimination that we can't undo if we don't give language to what is happening. And so you'll see here there is a graphic in terms of how the interlocking systems of power can occur, and the spaces we are most interested in are these ones where they intersect. Let's see, and here's another one, another representation. So here we have the structural forms of oppression listed out, and then here you have ways that they can intersect. And so this was also brought up in the chapter on Africana, African American, and Black Studies, the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's referenced again here because of the individuals who, well, if you go larger outside of the individuals, the community members that are being targeted have access different forms of intersections. So you have Black, queer, trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks. And these are the groups that can be the most disenfranchised and at risk of um, death, the most extreme outcome of the police brutality and the incarcerations. And so you get a little bit of a historical lesson here with trans women of color activism, both during the civil rights movements, the 1960s through the 1980s, with LGBTQ plus rights movements, especially as you're getting closer to um, uh, what was it? Uh, it's escaping me. Well, it's right here with Marsha P. Johnson and Stonewall. Thank you. There it is. Stonewall Uprising, 1969. And so you have groups that start speaking out about how they're being treated and how they're being um, disenfranchised and, in fact, uh, killed. And so Stonewall riots is kind of, and the Stonewall uprising is the start of what will later become Pride parades and the Pride movement. And the authors do a really good job of explaining who the leading front activists were. So Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And unfortunately, Marsha dies. They both die very young. Marsha was murdered, and Sylvia dies due to kidney cancer. But their activism work, and this is a great depiction here from the 1973 Gay Parade, Gay Pride Parade, was some of the grounding work in terms of trans rights and the mainstream gay liberation movement, and just really exemplifies how they were treated, mistreated, disregarded um, because of these multiple points of intersection. And I would say this is like one of the key sections. I would read it very carefully and bring questions to class because this is the question of the chapter. Now, when you go on to the next section, you're going to see intersectionality with another term called third world feminism. Um, and it's also, you know, you might have heard the term the uh, Third World Liberation Front. I've mentioned it in class before. So it's about how women of color experience different issues than a mainstream white feminist movement. And so you have here a really good trajectory of non mainstream feminist names. So you have here uh, a discussion about Arab culture in terms of what was happening with feminists and heteropatriarchal modes of understanding a family being one with heterosexual partners and the mother in the home taking care of the kids. And they transition that into third world feminism. So we have so many courses and so many authors on this topic. And it's important to understand that term, third world. So it's usually referred to underdeveloped, overexploited geopolitical entities, so like countries and regions and even continents. Oftentimes, if you, Africa was mentioned, especially in the 1990s when the AIDS pandemic was rising and there were a lot of deaths. Africa was depicted as this third world continent. But women of color kind of reclaim this term as a form of empowerment in order to highlight how they are marginalized under white feminists that present present the feminist movement going in a certain direction, oftentimes ignoring race, oftentimes ignoring nationality or language or immigration status or all these issues that women of color might be facing. And so, again, this was a time for women of color to stand up and say that their forms of oppression against a male patriarchal society was different than what the mainstream white feminist movement was experiencing. And how can these two communities kind of reconcile their goals? So, for instance, if you're thinking of a Black community, you could be thinking of how Black men are incarcerated at higher rates than any other group. And so, what does that do to a family unit? And then, what does that do to Black women who are now raising children as oftentimes single mothers? And then you get these stereotypes that are forming of the welfare mother or the um, really negative images, which aren't true, obviously. So I think that this section is really important to read slowly as well, and that the goal for third world feminists is right here to dismantle systems that oppress all women, including racism, sexism, classism, and imperialism. And then they juxtapose black, black feminists or third world feminism with other forms of feminisms. So then we have a really great section here on Chicana feminism and mestiza consciousness from Gloria Anzaldúa. One of her most famous books is called Borderlands or La Frontera. There's also some other really heavy hitting scholars from the field that are mentioned here, Dr. Chela Sandoval. Um, and it gets pretty high theoretical in terms of the discussion here, but it starts to narrow down in such a way that is grounded. And I think right here is key. A Chicana feminist point of view is rooted in Mexican history and it's located at intersections of. And so you get colonialism, violence, discrimination, racial and class hierarchies, Catholicisms, you have religion coming in, language repression, especially indigenous languages. And so this chapter really gives you a great introduction to a very complicated uh, amount of theory and literature you can read. Here's an example from the canonical textbook that I was mentioning, Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza, and it's full of poems and theoretical writings. I'll bring a copy of the book to class so you can see what it's like, and maybe we can do some kind of an activity related to this. And then finally, they end with a brief example of Pinaism, which is very much related to Asian American studies. And again, it's personal stories, it's struggle, survival, service, sisterhood. And this is very particular with Asian American or a Filipino kind of culture or racial group. The one thing that this section didn't really have a lot of was enough of indigenous forms of uh, knowledge. They get a little bit added here with the Chicana feminisms, but I felt like that could be its own section as well. And this is really, there's just a lot in this chapter. So then we get into reproductive justice. There's part 1 and part 2. And I think this is really important again, that when white women are fighting for rights in the 1970s, a lot of it had to do with the right to not have a child, the right to contraceptions, the right to abortion. And at the time, a lot of women of color were in different spaces in terms of what they were advocating for, because you had a lot of forced sterilizations that were going on for women of color, especially if they had no language in terms of being able to speak English and advocate for themselves, so they could go into the hospital to give birth and come out unable to have kids because a tubal ligation had been enacted upon their body. And it's been it's an interesting history. You have both the breeding of communities in order to use them for labor, and so you want certain groups to be reproducing again and again in order to have more of a labor source, because if you're breeding in captivity as slaves, then your children will be slaves. And so this section gives you a bit of a history about that slave, what they call slave slaveocracy, and enslaving a woman's fertility and her body. It's really, I should say this is a content warning. It can be uh, upsetting to read a lot of this. And then here's the portion I was talking about with the forced mass sterilizations and eugenicists, and ways that people's ability to procreate is taken away by the law, or by, quote, a doctor who is only looking out for one's best interest, so to speak. So, and there's a lot. Um, and if you see here, as you get later, 2020, really just a couple of years ago, and it's incarceration as a form of forcing sterilization, because once you are a criminal, you lose rights. Um, and then, of course, unfortunately, what was happening with indigenous women and their own sterilization. And then you get into the reproductive justice part 2, and a lot of this is what we are going through right now. So, a woman's right to choose when to have children or not, and being able to be an advocate for one's agency to have children or not. And with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, uh, just just moving so much further in terms of rights that women have fought for. So again, I would read this slowly, but also um, with some content warning, because it can get very personal, especially depending upon how you feel about autonomy and about reproduction and about abortions and about women's right to choose, and no matter where you might be on that spectrum. Okay, and then finally, we will end this chapter, because I know because I talk a lot, with transformational liberation through love. And so you have a picture here of Bell Hooks speaking, And a lot of what the goals of intersectionality, yes, is to show the oppressiveness that can happen with those that access multiple sites of power or lack of power, so to speak. But the goal is to get us into moving forward with love and self love, self care, writings by radical women of color, of finding a way to counter what's toxic white supremacists, imperialism, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, with all these hateful acts of violence and abuse that can happen against women, women of color, and queer and trans people. And if we can move through all of this disheartening, violent injustices with a message of love somehow, how can we heal, so to speak, from what has happened and continues to happen to this day? Another very important textbook, This Bridge Called My Back, writing by radical women of color. It's the entire book is an example of race, gender, class, sexuality, all these things intersecting, and many pieces are bleeding, so to speak. They're so raw and they're so emotional, and yet there's so much love and support and accepting of who the individuals are that are writing the pieces or that are sharing their poems. So this is pretty transformative. It's very radical. Here's another way of explaining it: radical self-love. It's countering hate with love. It's demanding more than what our society has given many of us. Law, medicine, education. And again, this is another great case story here that's explained with Sonia Renee Taylor with The Body is Not an Apology, the power of radical self-love. Uh, it's just, after reading so much heavy content warning chapters here, or sections of the chat in this chapter, to end with this radical self-love is just really powerful. And I think it's a different way of really understanding what ethnic studies is about, which is empowerment. It's breaking down standardized ways of thinking or being and showing that something else can exist, something that maybe you've never thought of before. And then, of course, it ends with let's see, with a coming of age stance as a decolonizing praxis. Again, we have methodology of the oppressed is mentioned again. Oh, and I love this section in that book, that falling in love can be a type of conduit for the action needed to resist oppression. It is love that can access and guide our theoretical and political movida, or movements, revolutionary maneuvers towards a decolonized being. And decolonization is itself a process of self-love, reclamation of our heritage, and it's a powerful act of counter hegemony. So really what you're trying to do is reclaim something that was stolen or lost or often taken away, and you bring it back in new ways and new forms. So you see, in terms of here, dancing and cultural practices, and it's just really empowering. So read this section very closely, and we'll probably do a really exciting activity around it in class. So then we get to our summary. The lecture was so long. I really enjoy this chapter. It's what I worked on as a scholar in grad school. I really hope you enjoyed reading this, and we'll talk more about it in class. Reach out with any questions. Thank you.